The bright blue paint shot out of the safe like a geyser, drenching her from head to toe. The woman, dressed in a crisp white blouse that now looked like a watercolor disaster, screamed in shock, staggering backward. Bystanders froze, their eyes darting between her and the black Navy veteran standing nearby, his arms crossed and a look of grim satisfaction on his face. The police officers who had been trying to calm the situation moments before now stared, wide-eyed, unsure of what to do. The crowd murmured, their whispers rippling with disbelief. How had it come to this? "Serves you right," someone in the crowd shouted, and a wave of murmurs followed. But the woman, her face twisted with anger and humiliation, still didn't seem to understand the gravity of what she'd done. And that's when she turned her rage, not on the Navy veteran, but on everyone around her. But how did this happen? How did a simple day at a parking lot escalate to a public spectacle? James Bryant, a retired Navy veteran, stood outside his car in the busy parking lot of a shopping center. He had just finished loading some groceries into the trunk when he noticed her. She was pacing a few cars down, glaring at him like he didn't belong there. James was used to the looks, the silent judgments. At 45, he carried himself with the same discipline and quiet strength he'd learned during his service. But even a calm demeanor couldn't stop people like her from assuming the worst. James didn't pay her any mind at first. He had lived in this town for years, and while not everyone was friendly, he never expected outright trouble. But as he closed the trunk and began to walk back to the driver's seat, she approached. Her face was pinched with suspicion. "Excuse me," she snapped, planting herself between him and his car. James sighed. "Yes, Mom? This isn't your car, is it?" she asked, her tone dripping with accusation. James, who raised an eyebrow. "It is. Is there a problem? You don't look like you could afford a car like this," she said bluntly, gesturing to the sleek black sedan parked behind him. James took a deep breath, biting back his frustration. "Mom, I served in the Navy for 20 years. I bought this car fair and square. Now, if you'll excuse me," but she wasn't listening. Instead, she whipped out her phone and began dialing. 911. "What's your emergency?" she said into the receiver. "There's a suspicious man here trying to break into a car that doesn't belong to him." "Yes, I'm sure. He's standing right in front of me." James couldn't believe it. "Are you serious right now?" She ignored him, continuing her description to the dispatcher. Moments later, 2 police cruisers pulled into the lot, their lights flashing. James knew better than to make any sudden moves. He stood by his car, hands visible, as the officers approached. The woman, now smug, crossed her arms and began explaining her version of the crime. "Officers, I caught him red-handed," she declared. "He was trying to break into this car. It's obviously not his." One of the officers turned to James. "Sir, can you show us some ID?" James nodded, reaching slowly for his wallet. He handed over his license and car registration, both of which matched the vehicle. "See?" James said calmly. "It's my car. I've done nothing wrong." The officer frowned, realizing the truth. But before he could say anything, the woman interrupted. "Don't just take his word for it," she shrieked. "What if he forged those papers? Look in the trunk! I saw him doing something suspicious." The officers exchanged uneasy glances. They could see James' credentials were valid, but the woman's persistence was escalating the situation. "I will show you," she said suddenly, marching toward the car. Before anyone could stop her, she opened the trunk and spotted a small safe inside. "What's in here?" she demanded, pointing at the box. James took a step forward. "Mom, that's personal property. You have no right to touch it." But she wasn't listening. Driven by a mix of entitlement and paranoia, she fiddled with the lock. And when she finally managed to pry it open, the safe hissed, releasing a burst of pressurized air before the blue paint exploded outward. The woman staggered, coughing and flailing as the thick, sticky paint splattered over her face, hair, and clothes. The crowd gasped in unison, and even the police officers froze for a moment, stunned by the sudden chaos. James watched with a mix of frustration and vindication. He had warned her. That wasn't just any safe, it was a decoy, equipped with a theft deterrent system meant to ward off anyone trying to break into it. "What?" the woman shrieked, wiping futilely at her face as the paint smeared further. "Why would you have something like this in your car?" Why would you break into someone else's property? James shot back, his voice steady but sharp. That safe is mine. It's designed to protect my belongings, something you clearly don't respect. The paint-covered woman turned to the officers, sputtering. Aren't you going to arrest him for this? One of the officers finally stepped forward, his tone firm. Mom, you broke into his property. You've already called us here under false pretenses. And now you've created this mess. This mess? She repeated, incredulous. He set a trap. This is assault. The other officer shook his head. No, Mom, it's not. You weren't invited to touch his things. You had no right to be in his trunk or tampering with his safe. The crowd was starting to grow, and whispers spread quickly. She deserved that. Who does she think she is? Why'd she call the cops in the first place? The woman glared at James, her humiliation now burning into fury. You've ruined my clothes. James gave a humorless chuckle. Lady, you've ruined your own day. All I wanted was to load my groceries and go home. After the paint fiasco, the officers took statements from James and the woman. While James remained calm and cooperative, the woman grew more agitated, shouting over the officers and trying to justify her actions. I was protecting the neighborhood, she argued. How was I supposed to know he wasn't a criminal? By not assuming he was one in the first place, one of the officers replied curtly. Eventually, the officers decided to let James go. They had no grounds to hold him, and he had clearly done nothing wrong. As for the woman, she was issued a citation for disorderly conduct and property damage. James loaded his groceries into his paint-splattered car and drove away, shaking his head. He didn't feel triumphant, just tired. Tired of the assumptions, the accusations, and the unnecessary drama. But as he left the parking lot, a small smile crept onto his face. If nothing else, he hoped the woman would think twice before messing with someone else's property again. As James drove home, his thoughts lingered on the encounter. He hadn't set out to make a scene, and he certainly hadn't wanted trouble, but trouble seemed to find him often, especially since his retirement. James Bryant started his day like any other. A cup of coffee, a jog through the park, and a quick trip to the grocery store. As a retired Navy man, he valued routine and simplicity. After decades of serving his country, he was finally enjoying a quieter life in his small town. But life wasn't always peaceful for James. As a black man, he had faced his share of prejudice, even during his years in uniform. He had grown accustomed to being questioned, doubted, and judged. Still, he carried himself with dignity, refusing to let ignorance dictate his actions. That morning, he decided to take his new car out for a drive. It was a well-earned gift to himself, a sleek black sedan, bought with years of savings and a hefty military discount. James loved the car, but he also knew it made him a target for people who thought someone like him didn't deserve such a nice ride. When he pulled into the grocery store parking lot, he noticed her immediately. She was standing by her car, glancing at him with a disapproving scowl. James knew the look, suspicion, entitlement, and a hint of fear, but he didn't let it bother him. He parked his car, grabbed a shopping cart, and headed inside. James was proud of his service in the Navy. He had risen to the rank of Chief Petty Officer, leading crews on missions that took him around the world. He had survived storms at sea, tense standoffs, and long deployments away from his family. But none of that seemed to matter when people saw the color of his skin before they saw the man he was. The car had been a symbol of his accomplishments, a tangible reminder of the life he had built through hard work and sacrifice. He didn't flaunt it, but he wouldn't apologize for owning it either. The woman, whose name was Margaret Sanders, had lived in the town her entire life. She prided herself on being vigilant, calling herself the eyes and ears of the neighborhood. But her self-imposed role often meant sticking her nose where it didn't belong. Margaret wasn't used to being challenged, and she didn't like it when people pushed back. To her, James represented an outsider, someone who disrupted the quiet, predictable world she had constructed in her mind. When she saw James in the parking lot, her prejudices kicked into high gear. She couldn't reconcile the image of a black man in a military-grade car with her narrow understanding of who belonged. Her assumption of guilt wasn't rooted in evidence, but in bias, an ugly truth she would never admit. The safe in James's trunk wasn't just for show. It was a precaution he had taken years ago after someone broke into his car and stole valuable personal documents. As a former Navy officer, James was meticulous about protecting his identity and sensitive information. The safe, a small but heavy box with reinforced steel and a built-in anti-theft system, was his solution. It had been designed to spray a harmless but bright and sticky paint on anyone who opened it without the correct code. James hadn't expected it to be used today, but he couldn't deny the satisfaction of seeing it work perfectly. She was trying to get the safe open when the paint burst forth, catching her square in the face. The shock of it caused her to stumble backward, knocking into her own car and smearing blue streaks across its pristine white surface. The crowd that had gathered couldn't hold back their laughter any longer. The sight of Margaret, once so haughty and self-assured, flailing and dripping with paint, was too much to bear. "Serves her right," muttered a teenager filming the incident on their phone. Even the officers struggled to keep straight faces as they wrote up their reports. Margaret, however, wasn't laughing. "This is assault!" she yelled again, but the officers remained unfazed. "No, Mom," one of them said calmly. "This is the result of you tampering with someone else's property. Now, if you'd like to press charges, you'll also need to explain why you broke into his car in the first place." Her protests grew weaker as reality set in. She had no excuse, no justification that would hold up. The story didn't end in the parking lot. By the next day, videos of the incident had gone viral. Social media was ablaze with discussions about Margaret's actions and James' calm response.